everyone, and welcome back to the Social Work Bubble podcast. I'm your host, Laura. I am a licensed clinical social worker here in New York. Yes, you heard it right. You heard it here. Not first, probably like third. But I passed my clinical exam on Saturday, May 18th. What a day. What a day. So today, this is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be diving into the application process, fees, how I prepared for the licensing exam, and also kind of like my next steps now that I'm an LCSW, what I do with all of that. So before we dive in, if you enjoyed today's episode, if you enjoyed the podcast, feel free to follow it, share it with a fellow social worker or anyone who would benefit from a social worker's perspective, and we will dive in. So I also want to preface this by saying I'm based in New York State. I am thinking about getting licensed in other states that are in surrounding areas like New Jersey, Pennsylvania, maybe even like some New England states. But the cool thing is that I work 100% remotely. This is something we'll be getting into when I talk about next steps in a little bit. So if you can work basically from anywhere in the world, as long as your clients are in the state that you're licensed in. So as long as your clients are residents of the state that you're licensed in. So for example, my own therapist is living in Mexico for a couple of months. She's licensed in New York, but she's able to live there for a couple of months because I live in New York. So it's not like I'm living somewhere else. So I want to preface that. I'm a New York State resident. I'm thinking about licensure in other states as well, but for now, I'm just living in the glory of getting my C. I do also want to preface this before we dive in that I know licensure is a controversial topic, rightfully so, because the ASWB exam has proven to be discriminatory and racist, and I think also ableist. All of the things that you can be, it is. So there's a big push to kind of do away with licensing or have some kind of alternative path. And I do think that's important because it's literally part of our job and our code of ethics to create like social change and systemic change, and the fact that the profession itself discriminates is not surprising, but it's bad. So I just want to preface that it is still an accomplishment, and I'm not minimizing the accomplishment piece, right? But it's also, licensing does still create barriers, especially when we get into the fees and the cost of it. And I will say, that was one of the reasons that I think it took me a little bit longer than I anticipated, was because I had to wait a few weeks until I got my next paycheck so I could put money specifically aside for this. So that's stuff to be mindful of. So I want to reiterate, please check out the discourse around this, see the action that you can do. I'll try to link some things below as well to help provide some education there. But again, in my eyes, it's still an accomplishment, and I do think it will help me kind of elevate my career and open up opportunities that I would not have as an LMSW, especially in New York. But yeah, it also creates a lot of barriers, systemic issues for other people. Now let's get into it. So the licensure process for me, I will also link this below. What you want to do is, based on the state that you're living in, you want to go to the website for the Office of Professions. So I went to the New York State Office of Professions website. Now, you'll probably already be familiar with this process if you're a licensed master social worker. It's very much repeating the same thing. It's just after you get your 2,000 hours of practice over 3 years and 100 hours of supervision. So it has to be over 36 months. You have to have at least 2,000 hours of direct client experience, and you have to have at least 100 supervision hours in order to submit your clinical application. So once you have that, you submit your actual application for licensure. That can be an online form. I think you can also mail it in, but online is honestly easier. The application itself is $294, which is real annoying because did I not just like pay for a master's degree? Next, you have to have your school. You have to touch base with your grad school again and have them resend your certification of professional education to prove that you have legitimate education. Why they do not keep this stuff on file from your former application, I do not know. I do not know. But alas, I had to contact my school again. They were able to send it in. I would honestly do that. A lot of this other stuff, I did the actual application last because it was an online application. As long as I had like the money to actually submit it online, I did everything else beforehand because it took some time, and you'll see where I had some hiccups. Then, at least in my situation, actually, no, not in my situation. If you were a professional and licensed in another state, you have to submit another form, kind of, I think, attesting to that. I did not have to do that. Then you submit another form that is a record of supervision of supervisors that will be submitting verification of your experience. So that's called Form 4. Form 4 is just a list of the supervisors that you have had that will attest to your experience. Now, what happens if you have to contact your supervisors and have them submit Form 4B. Form 4B is basically just them saying, okay, under my supervision, from this time to this time, Laura Swanson completed X number of clinical hours and X number of supervision hours with me. In total, like I said, that has to add up to 36 months, 2,000 hours of clinical experience, 100 hours of supervision experience. Now, I had some hiccups here because I have changed jobs. So, basically, right out of grad school, I stayed on at my field placement as like a professional working therapist. I had one supervisor for a time, then she resigned and worked elsewhere. Then I had another supervisor. Then I left that job and came to the job that I'm at now. So for my application, I had 3 different supervisors that needed to attest to my experience. I don't know if this is possible, but if you know that you're going to be leaving a job, or if a supervisor is leaving your job, and you know that is going to be part of your clinical and supervision experience so you can get your clinical license, I would try to get them to sign that form right then and there. Like before you leave your job, before they leave their job, even if you are still a little bit a ways from needing to submit your application, I would have that form. Now, granted, those forms could potentially change by the time it's time for you to submit your application, but they also will not. So I would do that just because it was a hassle for me to get in touch with these supervisors to attest to this experience, and it was a pain in the butt. Now, loophole situation, so basically I still had the personal phone number to my first supervisor. So I was able to text her and be like, hey, fun stuff, I'm getting my LC. I kept the logs. Supervisors are supposed to be the ones that keep the logs of your hours. Don't trust that. Keep your own logs. Keep your own hours. I sent her the logs, and be like, if this is right, if you can attest, like, these are correct, can you fill out Form 4B and send it in? They can email it, or they can, snail mail a hard copy. So my first supervisor was able to do that. I reached out to my second supervisor, and she told me that she did it. And maybe she did. maybe she didn't. First, I didn't have any personal contact information for her, and she had left the agency, so I had no idea how to get in contact with her. So I reached out to my agency in the HR department, and thankfully, the same woman that had been in HR when I worked there was still there, so she remembered me. She also had contact information for this supervisor, and because it was part of like licensure, it was important. So they were able to handle that. They were able to get me in touch with her. I had also reached out to like the director, because I think there is some kind of thing where if your supervisor has passed away or for some reason is just like unreachable, you can get your supervisor's boss or someone to attest to that experience, but they also have to be licensed in the profession. I think there's some kind of issue if they're, and this is what I ran into, is my boss's like boss was not a licensed social worker. They were maybe like a psychologist or something. So it was a mess. I eventually was able to get in contact with my second supervisor, and I think they had like snail mailed in the information, and I had checked with the Office of Professions and they never received it. So then I had to say, hey, I'm really sorry. They say that they never received this. Can you email it to this email address? I attached all the documents. I sent the email, and my supervisor was like, no, why don't you have the agency do it? So then I reached out to the agency, and the HR professional was able to email it, because you are not allowed to email it in yourself, which was very annoying. And then my third supervisor, my current supervisor, had no problem with it, because he's on top of it. And it's honestly easier when you're someone's current supervisor. So they submit each of their Form 4Bs. You have to keep track to make sure the numbers listed give you the total number of hours that you need. And then that's basically it. Now here's the thing. I had anticipated submitting this stuff in like December, because I did. I had like submitted this stuff and I was waiting and waiting and waiting. So I reached out to the Office of Professions and I'm like, have you gotten, like, what's the holdup? What's going on? And they were like, yeah, we haven't received your stuff from your second supervisor. You don't have enough hours for us to approve you. So that's when I had to reach out again. And it wasn't until maybe like last month, I think early last month in April, that I got approved to take the exam. So it took way longer than I was anticipating, because my hours qualified in like September 2023, because I had been thinking about taking the exam while I was on maternity leave. Well, guess what? I wouldn't have been able to do it because I didn't get any of the information they needed for months. So yeah, that also was honestly on me, because I probably wasn't pestering as much as I should have. So, some gentleness there. But, yeah, so that's that. All my supervisors eventually got my hours. The Office of Professions emailed me saying, hey, you have everything. You are approved to take your ASWB clinical examination. You can only register to take it once you've been approved by the Office of Professions, and they will give you like a little registration number and everything to do that. So, once you do that, then you register with the ASWB. The test costs a separate $260, which is just so crazy to me. So I registered to take it. Now, for me, myself, and I, this process had been long. I was tired. There were some things in my personal life I was going through. I also just have an infant daughter. So life was a lot different. It was busier. I hadn't studied for an exam in 4 years, 3.5 years at that point. Whoa. So I was nervous, but I also knew if I wait too many months, I'm not going to study. I know myself. I wait for the urgency to kick in. So I told myself, once I get approved, I am not waiting longer than a month. So I scheduled it for 4 weeks, exactly 4 weeks from the date that I got approved to take it, except that Saturday. So I scheduled it for a Saturday. I learned from my LMSW to not schedule it too early in the morning, because if you have listened to this podcast for a minute, you will know that the first time I was supposed to take my LMSW exam, it was at 8 a.m. on a Saturday, and I overslept and I missed my exam. And that was $240 down the drain. And they don't give you that money back. So then I had to schedule it again, pay another $200 whatever dollars. I scheduled it for later in the day. I did great. Passed. I learned from that. So today, this time I scheduled it for like a Saturday at 10 a.m. I made sure I knew where the testing location was, that I was familiar with the area. I live in a more rural area. When I took my LMSW, I was living in New York City. And it was, honestly, people say New York is easy to navigate, and I do think that's true, but it's also overwhelming. And I don't know, like there's so many places that are just in one building, so sometimes it can be hard to make sure you're in the right place. But this time it was a lot easier. So I knew that, scheduled my exam for 4 weeks out. Now, what I did from there was I had already purchased the Social Work ASWB Clinical Exam Guide by Dawn Apgar, the second edition. I bought this book on Thrift Books. Thrift Books is my go-to place to buy books. So you can buy them new and used, but they're like super, super cheap. So I know this book typically is pretty expensive. But I was able to get on Thrift Books for literally like $30. So I did that. Now, having to pay for study materials when you've already had to pay for an application and to register for an exam is insane. But compared to the original price of a new book, and it was still in new condition, like no highlights, it wasn't actually like used. It was still new, but it was only being sold for like $30. So I got that book. I also reviewed my stuff from my LMSW exam, and I have this cheat sheet that someone gave me from a workshop, a boot camp that they went to by, I think it's www.lmswexambootcamp.com by Professor Edith Chaparro, LCSW PhD candidate at the time. And when I say this was the most powerful thing for me to pass the exam, I mean it. Because at the end of the day, the exam is an application exam. There may be some things that test your knowledge, maybe, but honestly, there was a handful of questions that asked me like what a specific diagnosis would be, what a specific medication would be. The vast majority is application questions about safety. Straight up safety, or literally like what would be the best thing for you to do. What's the best thing for you to do? Biggest thing for the exam is knowing that it's person and environment, systems theory, self-determination. If you put that lens on of person and environment, strengths perspective, systems theory, you put that lens on and you view everything from that perspective, you are good to go. I say that with my whole heart. If you do that, if you rule out safety issues, substance abuse issues, or cognition issues first, it's like, honestly, just answer like, validate their feelings. Now, I am not liable if you take this advice and do not pass your exam. But these are generalizations based on my experience. But this kind of boot camp stuff was very, very helpful. It told you things like words to like not care about. You never want to answer a question with refer to a support group. You never want to do that. The only times you want to get supervision is if there's issues of like countertransference or transference or like a personal issue or bias, stuff like that. So yeah, a big part is really safety, making sure of safety. The other thing that I got was ASWB does provide like an official guide to like the content of the exam. So it's basically like a checklist of everything that you need to understand. It goes through those typical categories. Human development, diversity, and behavior in the environment is 24% of the exam. Assessment, diagnosis, and treatment planning is 30% of the exam. This was the other thing. In terms of treatment planning, being able to remember this perspective of engage, assess, plan, intervene, evaluate, terminate. If you hold that framework, you will do so well with questions that ask you, okay, so you did this thing, now what? What's next? What's first? Having that like timeline frame of reference, knowing the steps of a crisis intervention is also incredibly important. So it's really, again, a lot of this is just application stuff. Like, you know the steps to a process, and they're not going to tell you what's the next thing you would do using the treatment planning process. It's just going to ask you like a basic case study question, and you kind of have to remember that, okay, we're wearing these goggles of the treatment planning process, person and environment, client makes their own decisions, we empower, we get people to help themselves. What do we do? What's the best approach using that lens? And that was really helpful. The other part would be psychotherapy, clinical interventions, and case management, which is 27% of the exam. And lastly is professional values and ethics, which is 19% of the exam. So I didn't reference the checklist too much just because it was the same stuff that the APGAR book has in it. The other thing that I printed out was the actual NSAW Code of Ethics. And I did not do this last time, but it's so important. Actually read through the entire Code of Ethics. It can feel long. It's really not that long. I read it through out loud because I need like multiple learning things to help me remember something. So, and I'll talk about my process in a second, but I would read out loud while writing and mind mapping, and then I would go back and kind of read my mind map out loud to make sure. And while I'm doing that, I'm kind of pretending that I'm teaching a class because that helps me feel like I know what I'm talking about, and it helps me remember things. So read through the entire Code of Ethics. It's really not that long, and that'll help because there are enough ethics questions on there that you want to be careful with that. And then the last thing, third to last, I did use Quizlet for some flashcards. Occasionally, if I would get bored or tired of doing a mind map or handwriting things, I would put things into some Quizlet flashcards, and that would help just, with like more memorizing like terminology for things. I did use the Pocket Prep app because they would just do, like, you get like 1,000 practice questions, a bank of 1,000 practice questions. When I tell you, I scheduled myself out for a month. I did not start studying until like a week before the exam. If that. I think it was less than a week. And I went through, let me pull up my Pocket Prep real quick. Let me see. So I started going through Pocket Prep on Monday the 13th. I used it for 5 days through Friday the 17th. I did 748 questions out of 1,000, which is crazy. Now, with Pocket Prep, again, you have to pay for it. It's like a monthly subscription. So I paid like $20 for the month, which is crazy because I only had a week left until this exam. Now, I enjoyed Pocket Prep because they do split the questions into the 4 sections. So they're able to tell you what like your weakest category is and what your strongest one is. You can create quizzes for yourself. You can time a quiz. You can do missed questions, weakest subject, a mock exam, which, the questions on Pocket Prep are not entirely like the ones on there. For me, I use Pocket Prep as a means to make sure I understand all of the content. I do think Pocket Prep, compared to when I used it a few years ago for my LMSW, it's gotten a lot better using application questions but I still use it as a gauge to be like, okay, I know and understand the vast majority of the material and the content and the terminology. Now it's just a matter of like taking the test and applying all of the knowledge I have from this in a way that makes sense. And then the last thing I did was the day before the exam, I took the official ASWB practice test. You only get access to this if you are registered to take the exam. And, scam of all scams, you still have to pay $85 for it. So that's crazy. So I took the practice test. I passed the practice test the day before I took my test. And that's usually a pretty good indicator that you will be fine. I'm not saying it's guaranteed, because with the actual test, again, if you took the LMSW, you will probably know this. It's 170 questions. You are only scored on 150 because 20 of them are unscored, that they're like testing for future exams. You're only scored on 150, and there's kind of a range that you need in order to pass, and it differs on every single exam, because I think they base it on like the severity, the intensity, the difficulty of the question. It's kind of weighted a little bit. So the majority, I would say, fall within that, like around 100. You need around 100 questions to pass. For my practice exam, I needed 101, and I got 115 correct. So I was like, that's cutting it a little close. So then I continued to study, I continued to review, I looked over my notes, and then the following day, I needed 103 to pass, and I got 128 correct. So, that was that. I remember when I was taking the test as well, there were points when I'm like, I do feel like I'm flying through this. Because I did finish it in 2.5 hours, and I was truly filled with panic and anxiety. My hand was shaking, and I was like, I have failed. I have failed, because some of these seem way too easy and obvious, and they're trying to trick me, and I have failed. This is a failure. This is a flop. I got my hopes up when I passed the practice test, and now I'm failing. That was not the case. It was just because I was prepared, apparently. So that was that. In terms of how I took notes, as I said, I'm a pretty I like a lot of different methods to study. I don't ever really like watching videos just because I get bored a little bit, but I love a mind map. So I would go through a section, and I would put my piece of paper in the horizontal perspective, and I'd put the topic in the middle with a little cloud around it, and then around that I would just build onto, these are the things to remember. It was great to do with disorders, because you would just get at the main things. And then I would also just take random notes here and there. Because another thing that I did with pocket prep is when you get a question wrong, and even when you don't, it gives you the option to look at the rationale and the explanation. And I would do that for every question, even if I got the question correctly, because it was still a good spot to get more background information. And I'm pretty sure they base all their questions off of information from the APGAR book, I think. So it definitely just reinforced each other. I didn't read every single page in the APGAR book, but I was pretty close. I really stuck to the sections. I did pocket prep for a couple of days, and then I looked at what sections were my weakest, and I read through those sections of the APGAR book. So I did that. And again, sometimes it just was getting into the practice of it and kind of getting into that groove of what they were looking for. So that was the process. I think that we're kind of prohibited from talking about the actual content of the exam, the specifics of it. So I'm not gonna get into any of that, but I will just emphasize, definitely make sure that you practice questions that are about any kind of safety issue. When there's any kind of ideation or thoughts, you want to assess and get more information. When there's a plan and intent, you want to take action and make a report, call 911. When there are suspicions of abuse, you make a child abuse report, stuff like that. So that's the difference. Thoughts and ideation mean that you get more information, you assess, stuff like that. When there's actual intent or a plan, that's when you have to take action. I would also, let's see, child abuse I think was bigger than I was anticipating, and that can be hard because sometimes it's hard for me to remember what exactly is neglect, because I think sometimes it's hard for me to know if the test, because remember, so much of this is you're not actually maybe answering on what you would actually do, but what the test wants you to do, what they're testing for. And that can be a mental funk. And so I know poverty is not a reason to call Child Protective Services, but at what point are the children at risk? And does the test want you to do a certain thing? That can be a little hard. So I definitely would probably spend more time looking back, studying more like child abuse and neglect, actual, I guess like interventions, like when to intervene, when to call, what's that line between no, it's okay versus oof, this is report worthy. It was easier to do with things like physical abuse and sexual abuse. It was harder to do with things like neglect. And then, yeah, I think overall just keeping in mind those bigger concepts of like the therapeutic relationship is the most important thing, especially in the first couple of sessions. That is the primary focus. It's not anything else. You can always get information at another point. The most important thing is building that rapport. I think at its very core, the concepts and ideas are very simple. We are person-centered, person and environment, systems theory. We are the treatment planning process. If you keep that perspective on and just try to work with that lens, that's really important. If you do know a lot of it is just knowing the processes, like knowing the group formation process, stuff like that. So, yeah. That was that. Honestly, something I would do now is every testing center is different. I would dress in layers because it was so hot in the testing room, and the proctor apologized to me afterwards because she was like, I'm not allowed to keep the door open, but I tried to like do it just when people were like leaving and going out to offer some cool air, and I'm like, I was wearing a turtleneck because it was a cold, rainy day, but it was so warm in there. I'm one of those people that I don't take breaks. I don't know if I would recommend that, but I mean, this is also just how I am, is I just like to see something through to the end. When I start a puzzle, I'm like finishing that puzzle in one sitting. Like it's probably a problem. But I would probably have brought water with me. Now, again, you probably already know this if you took the LMSW exam, but you cannot bring those things in with you. They have to stay in a locker. But you can take, I think, unlimited untimed breaks, but it does take away from the time that you have on the actual test. So I would keep that in mind. The actual testing experience was good in terms of, so when you end the exam, right now, I'm a little all over the place, but something else to keep in mind is the ASWB is transitioning to using PSI as the platform that they use for testing in their testing centers. So, and they have not updated the official practice exam. So the official practice exam is using kind of the program and formatting of the previous programming and formatting. And so when I got to the testing center, it was still easy to use. Like, they'd give you a tutorial on like how to use the actual like program the test is on. But it was different, and that did catch me off guard because I was worried about like, oh, can I still highlight? You can't highlight in as many colors. You can only highlight in one color. You can't strike out things, so you can't strike things through, which was annoying because I like to have that visual. But you are given a whiteboard and an eraser and a dry erase marker. So I like to have that visual of what answers I've crossed off because it helps me mentally pare things down. So I would just write out A, B, C, D and like cross them out. Now, it's not labeled A, B, C, D on the thing, but you're able to figure that out. At the end of the exam, they do make you do 2 surveys that it's about like your testing experience and your registration experience. And this is before you have your test results. So when I tell you, my hand was literally shaking because I was like, I don't know how I did, and they want me to answer these questions. This is just some feedback because I do research on the side. I assist in some research in social work. That's not, to me, that's not good research practice. You should not have people try to take a survey and plan on them giving accurate results when they are anxious about how they did on a test. That seems like poor research practice to me. Maybe like give them the option after they've taken the test so they have some level of relief or lower anxiety. Because let me tell you, I just answered very satisfied on every single one of those questions because I was just trying to skip through to get to my results. So that's just some feedback for ASWB. I would revise your research and survey taking process there. Because that was annoying. I just wanted to know how I did. And then when my vision literally blurred a little bit at the end because I'm like trying to scan the screen for like, what does it say? Where does it say how I did? And then it said passed. And when I tell you, I got emotional. I didn't start crying, but there was just a lot more writing on this exam. It felt higher stakes. Again, like there was just some other things going on in my life where I really doubted my ability to pass the exam. I barely had any time to study. I was really, really nervous. During the whole week, if you ask like my partner, I would just constantly be saying, I'm not confident. Well, I talked to my supervisor this week because he knows I'm supposed to take it on Saturday. And I was just like, I'm telling you right now, I do not plan on passing the exam. I have very low expectations, but I'm going to go for it. And he was like, good for you. I'll support you, whatever. And so that's that. Now, this does bring me into next steps. So I've talked about this, I think, a few times before. I do apologize for the noise, by the way. It's a beautiful day, so I put the windows open, and I'm realizing to record a podcast that might have been a mistake. But alas, here we are. Next steps for me. Basically, I let my supervisor know, hey, I'm an LCSW now. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in the state of New York. How cool is that? And I work at an incredible, incredible practice. I work at Lincoln Square Psychotherapy based out of New York City. I would recommend them as an employer. I would recommend them as a place to get therapy. It's been such a healing experience, especially when I started off in social work, not having a lot of support, kind of just like in the trenches. It's been like such a beautiful place to be at. So 10 out of 10 there. But basically my boss, kind of sets everyone up to go on to their own practice. We don't have a non-compete clause. He encourages us to, like, for continuity of care, to bring all of our clients with us. And basically, like, once we get our LCSW, we can have the option of staying on if we want to. We can progress into leadership if that's something that we want. But I think most people end up going to start their own private practice. And that is what I will be doing. So I've already met with Headway. Headway is an insurance paneling place / office manager. Like, they kind of handle all of that. And that is, I think, who I'll be using for insurances. And I'm going with Headway. It was between Headway and Alma. I did think about using both. The only difference is I think Headway does Anthem Empire and Alma does Anthem Emblem. The vast majority of my clients are on Anthem, or formerly Blue Cross Blue Shield Empire. So I'll be going with them for that, and I will be able to keep, I think, all of my clients, which is really exciting. And I'm not going to lie, the most exciting part is I'm going to be getting, I think, like almost double the pay. Now the hiccup with Headway is that from like start to finish, it does take like 60 days to receive your first paycheck. But man, that paycheck's going to be hefty, isn't it? So you have to kind of financially plan for that. Make sure that you have some stuff set aside so you can like pay rent and eat for those 60 days. But yeah, all of my clients know this is something that when I was planning on going on maternity leave, I thought I would be taking the exam while I was on leave, and the timing and the process just took a lot longer. So my clients knew at that point I would be going off on my own in a few months' time to start my own practice. And all of them said that they want to come with me if I still accept their insurance. Even some of them were just like, well, even without insurance, I'm still willing to like self-pay or figure out something there. So I'm really excited about it. I'm really excited. Yeah, I mean, more details to come. So in the next couple of months, you will see me kind of go out on my own as a private practitioner. I'm going to say this right now. I love being a therapist. I adore it. I don't know if I see myself having a group practice or running a group practice. I do see myself in the nonprofit world. It has always been a dream of mine. I know there's kind of like weirdness with like, oh, another white woman being an executive director in the nonprofit industrial complex. Oh, it is not lost on me. But I grew up in a small town that has been riddled with and really, really suffers with a huge, huge lack of mental health and substance use resources. And it has always been my dream to go back, or even in like a similar community, form a treatment center, even just like a place that also just incorporates, I don't know, like spirituality, like various types of therapy that aren't just like the traditional talk therapy. And that's the dream down the road, which, I mean, could even be in a few years. Right now, having my own solo private practice works for what my family needs, works for what we need. Financially, it gives us so much more stability and freedom. We have some debt to pay off. So I'm going to be so frank with you. I don't think it's my dream to stay in private practice because I have an issue with it. I have an issue with it. But I also think that I'm allowed to take care of myself as well, and that I cannot dismantle my issues, like systemic issues, solo. So at least for the foreseeable couple of years, I'll be in private practice, just a solo practice. I don't anticipate it growing. I mean, that could honestly change. Who knows? But this is where I'm at right now, and this is the plan. So, yeah. That's what you will see. That's how I passed the LCSW exam. Wow, that's crazy. What's crazy too is my dad told me, because I like messaged my family group chat, I'm like, I passed, I crushed it. And my dad was like, that's so crazy, because exactly 5 years ago, exactly on that day, I graduated with my bachelor's in social work. And it was exactly to the day, 5 years later, that I became a licensed clinical social worker. So it's really exciting. It's becoming an LMSW was really exciting, but there's something about like putting in 3 years of work, thousands of therapy sessions, where it's like, man, it's sweet. It is a victory. Wow. So that's that. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. We'll be back hopefully to regular scheduled programming. I took a couple weeks off, as you know, because of all the stuff going on. And so we'll be back. I want to make sure everyone knows I'm going to be getting to more guests on the podcast. I have a whole list of people I need to reach out to. I had to reschedule some people because of those things that were going on and studying. But we're going to be back at it, normal, all that fun stuff. So I hope to see you next time. And thank you so much for listening. Bye.